The Milwaukee Police Department has conducted a comprehensive internal investigation into the officer-involved shooting of Dontre Hamilton at Red Arrow Park on April 30th, 2014. The department's continuing authority to conduct internal investigations into these incidents is specifically allowed under the new state law requiring the criminal investigation of officer-involved shooting deaths to be led by an outside investigative agency. Today, I will provide you with the details of this incident, present the internal charges I have brought against the involved officer, and describe the discipline I have imposed and the grounds for that discipline. On April 30, 2014, 2 Milwaukee police officers were dispatched twice, first at 1:52 p.m. and then again at 2:09 p.m. by our communications division to respond to a request from an employee at the Starbucks located in Red Arrow Park to check the welfare of Mr. Hamilton, who was laying or sleeping on the sidewalk near that Starbucks. Those officers complied with their training and our department policy related to the handling of emotionally disturbed persons and followed relevant training related to the standards required to conduct a pat-down search. Their handling of the complaints involving Mr. Hamilton did not result in any physical contact with him, and the officers found no cause for additional police action. At 3:28 p.m., Milwaukee Police Officer Christopher Manny, the beat officer for this section of downtown, responded to a voicemail left for him by a desk officer from District 1 to respond to Red Arrow Park to check the welfare of a citizen based on a complaint from a Starbucks employee. Officer Manny was not aware that the 2 officers had already twice responded to the park and cleared the calls for service. Upon his arrival, Manny found Mr. Hamilton lying on the sidewalk near the Starbucks. Manny approached Hamilton, identified himself, and asked Hamilton to stand up. When Hamilton stood up, Manny approached him from behind, reached under his arms, placed his hands on Hamilton's chest to conduct a pat-down search, and asked him if he had any weapons. As Manny began the search, Hamilton began fighting with Manny, and a violent physical confrontation ensued, with Manny and Hamilton engaged in a series of punches and strikes to each other's heads and faces. Manny then attempted to use his baton to subdue Hamilton, but Hamilton was able to take the baton from Manny. Hamilton swung the baton at Manny multiple times and struck him on the side of the neck with that same baton. Fearing that Hamilton would seriously injure or kill him, Manny transitioned to the service weapon, firing multiple rounds at Hamilton to stop the threat. Mr. Hamilton died of his wounds. Now, our code of conduct requires us to hold ourselves accountable for our actions. Our core values of courage, competence, integrity, leadership, restraint, and respect guide our rules, our policies, our procedures, our awards, and our disciplinary actions. We must always calibrate our actions based on the circumstances we find ourselves facing. Policing is a difficult and challenging profession in which we are expected to make decisions, sometimes split-second, life or death decisions in ambiguous circumstances with incomplete facts. We know and expect that our decisions will be evaluated. In this case, we have a series of decisions by Officer Manny that resulted in the taking of a human life. While I find errors in the judgment of Officer Manny, there was no malice in his decisions. Every internal investigation is conducted and evaluated on the specific facts of the situation being investigated. In this case, we did not simply review the use of force by Officer Manny. We reviewed every aspect of the situation, from the handling of the original call for service, to the dispatch of Officer Manny, to his approach and contact with Mr. Hamilton, to his ultimate use of force. Every internal investigation also includes an assessment of aggravating and mitigating factors. Specifically, I review the employee's motivation. Was the employee acting in his or her interest or the interest of the public? I review the employee's experience. Can the alleged judgment error be attributed to the employee's breadth and depth of experience? We also evaluate whether the alleged error was intentional or unintentional, the employee's past record, both positive and negative, and the degree of harm caused by the employee's conduct. Christopher Manny, by his own statements in his response to charges, accurately assessed Dontre Hamilton as an emotionally disturbed person. He made a determination that Mr. Hamilton was dangerous based solely on observations of apparent mental illness, absent any overt actions on the part of Mr. Hamilton. Despite his accurate assessment of Mr. Hamilton as an EDP, Christopher Manny treated Hamilton as though he were a dangerous criminal instead of following his training and treating Mr. Hamilton as an EDP. Christopher Manny's approach, including an out-of-policy pat-down, was not based on individualized reasonable suspicion, but on an assumption of his mental state and his housing status. This intentional action, in violation of training and policy, instigated a physical confrontation that necessitated a use of deadly force. Based on the comprehensive internal investigation conducted by the Milwaukee Police Department, I charged Officer Manny with a violation of our core value 1.00, competence, in reference to his out-of-policy contact with Mr. Hamilton, which ultimately led to his within-policy use of deadly force. Based on the totality of the circumstances, including the aggravating and mitigating factors I've described, I signed an order terminating Christopher Manny from his employment with the Milwaukee Police Department earlier today. Questions?
Why did you exclude the Hamilton family from this meeting right here?
This isn't a meeting, this is a press conference.
Okay, is there a reason that you wanted them to see it on TV rather than actually see it here since they were present and available?
This is the first I've heard they're present and available, but normally when I give a press conference, I give a press conference for the press.
Chief, could you clarify, you're saying the use of deadly force was appropriate, it's the pat-down that was not appropriate?
The initial approach was the approach that would be appropriate perhaps to a criminal suspect. But we've got training and protocols that guide our approach to people that are apparently mentally ill. Going hands-on with a pat-down that was not justified by reasonable suspicion resulted in the confrontation. Confrontation clearly escalated to a very dramatic, violent, and dangerous end. But the instigating factor in our judgment was the incorrect and out-of-policy approach to someone that the officer had perceived already to be an EDP, not a criminal suspect.
Will you be undertaking any additional training for any of your officers, given what happened in this situation? I mean, are you confident that all the other officers have been adequately trained so that they don't make the assumptions that you said Officer Manning did?
Well, he had the training. All right, every officer that works downtown is giving some training on the fact that they have to deal with a fairly significant homeless population, a subset of which is suffering from various forms of mental illness. We've currently got 367 officers that have gone through the entire CIT training. And as you know, in 2013 we responded to over 8,000 health calls for mentally ill people. We've also got a 30-member homeless outreach team that works almost exclusively downtown. They've had extensive training. Starting in January this year, all of our officers, starting in January of 2015, all of our officers are going to get 16 hours of training on dealing with the mentally ill as part of their in-service. But we also do periodic training on this as well. He specifically had gone through some training because he's part of the downtown district. And so, our judgment was based not only on his evaluation of his tactics, but also in light of the fact that he should have known better.
He was involved in that situation with the clown, you recall, a couple of years back, where there was a fight on the corner over here. Was there any disciplinary action following that and his appropriateness in approaching that person?
Well, that circumstance, despite how it appears on television, was nonetheless evaluated, and it was seen to be a mutual combat situation that was not outside of policy.
What was that sparked? Were you able to determine if it was sparked the same way this one was, by perhaps an approach that wasn't appropriate?
It was a different set of circumstances.
Chief, any truth to rumblings that there are police officers who may be having T-shirts made stating they stand with Officer Manny, or any talk of a slowdown in response to this action?
Listen, let me make something very clear. I expect the police department to act in a professional manner. I also expect people to have an emotional reaction to this. There's certainly going to be a subset of police opinion that's going to say, hey, wait a minute, we had a copper who was fighting for his life, used deadly force, and you're firing him. Okay? I understand that. My inner cop is not dead. Every member of this police department at some point in time has had to make critical decisions under pressure with insufficient information that could have gone wrong. Here's the point I want to make. There's got to be a way for us to hold ourselves accountable absent putting cops in jail for making mistakes. All right? We live and work in an extraordinarily dynamic profession that right now has been delegated by society every significant social problem. Tell me where the mental health workers are out there 24 hours a day. Tell me where the substance abuse workers are 24 hours a day. Tell me where the homeless outreach workers are out there 24 hours a day. Tell me where anybody is 24 hours a day but the cops, who are also expected to deal with robbery, murder, aggravated assault, rape, and various other depredations. All right? Any decision we make can go badly wrong. Cops have an expectation that I will empathize with their plight, as well I should. But I've also got an obligation to the department as a profession to hold ourselves accountable when the decision was an incorrect decision that went against our policy and training. That's the key here. We've had people that have made wrong decisions before and there was no guiding policy. We've had people that made mistakes before. We had not done any relevant training. But we've got a policy and training, and it was still the wrong decision. And in that context, it's my obligation to judge the decision and to take into account the dire consequences that emanated from that decision. And when an officer puts themselves in a situation where they have to use deadly force, my feeling is they've got to be evaluated professionally. All right? We're not talking war crimes here. We're not talking that every cop that makes a mistake has to face grand juries and go to jail. But there has to be a consequence. And we, in the management profession with administrative responsibilities, have to be willing to exert strong discipline when an incorrect decision that goes against policy results in an outcome such as this.
Were you able to look at similar cases from the last 20 years, or is this sort of new ground for you in this matter?
Well, we've not been shy about holding officers accountable. I think we've also made a fairly strong distinction that we're willing to endure, outrage if, based on our policy, training, and the actions of the officer and all the circumstances, a good faith decision breaks bad. All right, and that's going to happen in this world. What makes this thing different is we have specific policies and trainings that would have guided the officer towards a different set of initial decisions. It was an incorrect, wrong decision that placed him ultimately in legitimately deadly jeopardy. But the challenge is, what about that decision? And we believe this officer had the training and policy guidance to have made a better decision that would not have resulted in this outcome.
What happens next? Do you expect charges to come up? Do you expect this to be it?
You mean from the district attorney?
Yes.
You know, I've not had any consultations with him. He's got his own decision to make, and, you know, he's going to make it on the totality of the information in his possession. So I can't say I have an expectation. If you're asking me an opinion, it's clear to me, based on the facts that I have, and I don't pretend to have all the facts that he has, that the use of deadly force, by the time it was used, was needed to stop a legitimately perceived threat of imminent bodily harm. But he is the one with the responsibility of applying the relevant legal standard, and I have to leave the details of that decision to him.
Is your investigation being made available to the DA?
Well, if he requests it, we certainly will give it to him. We're not going to make it publicly available yet, because if the DA has facts that I don't, some of those facts theoretically could result in additional charges or the reopening of an internal. But we felt we had sufficient information at this point to render a decision.
So I know that you had made your decision on probably various things, and you looked at various things. What about this person who had claimed that there was no strike by Dontre, that there wasn't this hit that has been reported? I mean, is that person just at a different vantage point? Like, what can you talk about?
The internal affairs people evaluated the written interviews of literally dozens of eyewitnesses. The overwhelming preponderance of eyewitnesses witnessed Dontre approaching the officer with the baton, with it over at his head, and more than a few of them, several of them identified the officer being struck. Yes, I believe we had one person that claims it didn't happen. We have some people that claim to have seen things from 2 blocks away. I mean, there's, you know, this is the world of eyewitness testimony, but the overwhelming preponderance of witnesses with a vantage point that, you know, clearly would indicate they could see what they claim to have seen, support that this was an ongoing assault.
Do you expect to be in contact with Dontre Hamilton's family, and what are you going to tell them?
Well, you know, we've made our finding, okay? We've certainly held an officer accountable. We've made a presentation to the community. I haven't made a decision as to whether or not to have any subsequent meetings.
Did what happened in Ferguson influence you in any way?
You know, if it did, it would be unethical, all right? You know, there are going to be people out there that are going to have opinions about that. The fact is this, you know, we're a professional agency. Professional agencies have to hold themselves accountable to a professional standard. That professional standard relates directly to whether or not that agency has anticipated situations that require training and or policy. And when they have that training and policy, and they're violated, and there's a fatal outcome, we have to take an action. If they're violated and there's not a dire outcome, lesser discipline can be appropriate. But in this case, obviously the degree of harm is significant.
What's Manning's mental state right now? You say you fired him today. Can he reapply for his job? Is that something he may do and try to get it back from the
You know, I don't know. I have not had any contact with him. Certainly, I would expect that he has been undergoing an extraordinary amount of mental stress since this incident. Any officer involved in the use of deadly force goes through significant results. You know, we've got a police officer support team that deals with people that have responded to dramatic crises or had to use deadly force. You know, we have had you know, incidents in this department where people have had to receive counseling. It is extraordinarily stressful, and if you add to that people calling for your imprisonment and immediate jailing and firing and demonstrations, of course you're going to be suffering a great deal of stress. So I certainly would expect that his mental state has been under duress for some period of time.
Will you be releasing his photo or personnel file?
We will make an evaluation of that after this press conference.
Chief, I'm sorry, you said you personally did not speak to Officer
No. No. You say Officer Manning?
Manning?
I did not personally speak
You
to
did not speak to him personally?
No.
Chief, you talked a lot about the mental stress that goes along with the use of force incident. Some of these officers then go on to file for duty disability. Has Officer Manning filed for duty disability?
Not to my knowledge. You know, we're not routinely advised when that happens.
Chief, you made a comment earlier about absent putting cops in jail, that there has to be a way to address these issues. Given your review of this, if you were to be making a decision as you would in any other investigation about whether to refer it to the DA for criminal charges, do you think Officer Manning should face criminal charges in light of what you know?
Well, in every case that we have a police use of deadly force, those cases automatically go to the district attorney's office for review. I mean, this is no exception to that. But based on our evaluation of the information we have, he did not act outside of policy, using the force he used as the confrontation escalated. Now, again, the disclaimer for me has got to be, I don't have all of the information the district attorney has, but based on what we do have, we don't see him as having acted outside of policy.
Meaning having committed a crime.
Well, I have to leave that determination to the DA, so I've got to stop short of making that decision myself.
And you just referred to perhaps some criticism which you might be receiving, which has already started from Alderman Bob Donovan, who said this decision reeks of politics. Would you like to comment on that?
No.
Is there a political motive here? I mean, are there political considerations?
If there was any political motive on this, if anybody in my reporting chain had expected me to do this or put pressure on me to do this, I would have resigned. This is my decision alone, based on the facts of this case and our responsibility to hold ourselves accountable. And anybody else who says something else is doing their own brand of politicking.
Can you talk a little bit about how the department handled the family protests specifically? Because I know that it seemed like you were blocking off traffic for them, that sort of thing. Can you just talk a little bit about that particular aspect of this?
Well, I mean, our approach to handling these protests has been to give them the opportunity to advance their cause and to make their point. We're obligated not only to protect life and property, but also to protect First Amendment rights. And I think our challenge to protect those rights is even more significant when the people that are demonstrating against us. So in the light of that situation, we've done all that we can to make sure that these demonstrations, none of which have had a permit, none of which have taken to the streets with the permission of any authority, are nonetheless policed in a way that keeps the demonstrators safe and advances the free flow of traffic. A couple of weeks ago, we did a good job on protecting the demonstrators, but a bad job on the free flow of traffic. But generally speaking, we've been able to do both, and that's our obligation. I mean, at some point in time, people have tried to get arrested. They failed so far. I can't guarantee that at some point in time we would end up arresting somebody. It might become necessary. But we also recognize for a subset of these demonstrators, getting arrested is part of the plan. And we believe that we don't want to necessarily accommodate that, but rather simply create an environment which these demonstrations can take place safely.
Do you believe today's decision will force officers, if they're ever in this situation again, to maybe hold back, rethink? Because you said it's a split-second decision. What are they supposed to do when they confront someone?
Well, the challenge is, as I say, there's going to be the initial reaction, which I expect and understand, which is anger, frustration, and a sense of betrayal. All right? I get it. Totally get it. They're living on the edge every day, and they expect uncritical support when one of their colleagues takes an action and finds themselves in jeopardy. All right? I understand that. Having said that, this decision is not about the split-second decision to use deadly force in a deadly encounter. This decision is very simple. When you are approaching a mentally ill person who is not being engaged in violent behavior or criminal behavior, there's a set of trainings and approaches that you are taught. And you don't go hands-on and start frisking somebody only because they appear to be mentally ill. A, it's not a good idea because many people in that condition will react violently to being touched. B, it's legally not a good idea because if you don't have an articulable suspicion, you don't have the right to pat somebody down. That's what this is about. Because in taking those actions, Manny instigated, certainly not on purpose, certainly not with malice aforethought, but bad tactics and bad decisions resulted in this escalation that necessitated the use of deadly force. Now, officer-created jeopardy is a term that has real meaning in the training circles of police departments around the country. Officers in the last 10 years have been instructed to get out of the way of speeding cars, not to shoot at them. Officers around the country are operating under stricter guidelines on when to initiate pursuits, because pursuits can present a real threat to innocent third parties. And officers in their use of force are taught not to create circumstances that place them in a situation where they have no choice. Now, those circumstances may well present themselves, but this was not a call of a mentally ill man waving a gun. This was not a call of a mentally ill man threatening to kill other people. This was a check the welfare call. Tactics matter. Approach matters. And again, if the outcome had been benign, we'd be looking at a training issue. But the outcome matters. All right? We're not treating this as though some officer got out of bed in the morning and said, today's the day I get to shoot a homeless mentally ill man. We don't need to demonize this officer in order to hold him accountable for his decisions. There's been far too much of that in some of these demonstrations. This is a human being, a trained police officer, who made a decision outside of his training and policy who created a deadly encounter. And we as a profession have to hold ourselves accountable when that happens.
Chief, there's been much discussion about this particular case being sort of the test case, if you will, of the new law about an independent investigation. And there's also been a lot of discussion about the fact that these independent investigators basically grew up at MPD. Do you have any concerns that what was supposed to have been an independent investigation may be tainted just by virtue of that relationship, if not by, any actual?
There are people out there who will not support any investigation unless it results in a police officer in jail. All right? There are people out there that no matter how many checks and balances we create are going to find some way that they weren't really objective. This is the way I look at it. No one in the state of Wisconsin has 1/10 the experience of a trained Milwaukee police detective in investigating violent acts generally or police-related shootings specifically. Nobody. I can't go to Elkhorn and find somebody who's going to come do our investigations. One agency in the entire state has significant experience besides us. It's DCI. And yes, they hire retired Milwaukee police as well as other people because no one has more experience. Now, I'm an accountable public figure. The Attorney General is an accountable public figure. His people are accountable public figures. I say evaluate the results of the investigation. Turn them over to outside experts from wherever you think is better. Turn them over to Chicago. Maybe they're better, although I doubt it. All right? Turn them over wherever. Evaluate the results. But I am not comfortable saying that the actions of our officers in this city should be evaluated by people who have no experience investigating these cases. And if there's a body of people that have that experience that aren't DCI, I'll be interested to find out who it is. But right now, if you have an experienced investigative staff in this state, you've likely hired people from this city.
Do you recognize the potential for conflict of interest?
I recognize the potential for an opportunity for controversy. I don't see a conflict of interest unless we decide that everybody that leaves here is an unethical person who will violate their new oath of office in order to protect former colleagues. If that's your assumption, there's nothing we can do about it. If that's one's assumption, there's nothing we can do about it.
Chief, I'm sorry if everybody else knows this and I don't, but can you explain to me, the internal investigation is separate from the DCI investigation?
That's correct. The law allows us to conduct our internal investigation. It has to do with whether or not the officer complied with departmental policies and procedures. So that's separate from a criminal investigation.
And the DCI investigation is the one that has already been presented to the district attorney?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks, guys.
All right. Thank you, everybody.